ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
When Gillian Deakin was growing up, she lived close enough to Taronga Zoo in Sydney to hear the lions roar at night. The Catholic nuns who taught her at school emphasised the need to give back, and it's something she saw her parents do regularly. So she decided she would become a doctor. But Gillian didn't want to be the kind of doctor who sees patients in a small box for 12 hours at a time. She wanted to do things a bit differently. Her medical career has taken her to Antarctica, a trip that required her to have her appendix removed preemptively. It's taken her to Kiribati, and it's gotten her into the room with a Bhutanese princess. Gillian's new book is called What the Hell is Wrong with Me? Hello, Gillian.
Hello, Zana.
That is a great title for a book, but I want to start with your family, actually. You had 8 siblings growing up. Where did you fit in that lineup?
Right down the bottom where it wasn't very important, number 7. So there was rapidly 2 babies after me, so I was just in the slipstream.
With that many kids, I imagine you would have all had tasks at home that you were responsible for. What was your job?
Yeah, my job, I remember getting out of bed at 6, no one prompting me, and going downstairs and setting the table for 11 people, knives, forks, spoons, plates, everything on the table. And that was after I'd done 10BX exercises. That's Canadian Air Force exercises. We did them every morning. They're aerobic exercises, push-ups, jumping jacks, running on the spot, sit-ups. That was routine every morning.
From how old?
Early as I remember.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
So you'd wake up as a young child, do your exercises, and then go set the table.
Yep, that would be it.
You could hear lions roaring from your bedroom window.
That's right. We were very near the zoo. So my brothers used to break into the zoo to collect all the bottles to make income, but have to run through the bison's cage. So that was always, would he make it before the bison worked out? That was
Did
a
they
target.
have any close calls? Oh
Yeah,
my gosh.
for sure.
And was it magical or scary to be hearing lions roaring from your bedroom as a child?
When the wind blew from the south, it was definitely they lions had escaped, because that meant I could hear them very loudly. And so that night I'd always be saying, Dad, the lions have escaped. And I'd need to be persuaded that that wasn't the case.
That's terrifying. What are some of your other early memories of being at home with your mum and siblings?
Well, you think it's very normal to grow up in a family of 9 and have tasks like that. And, you know, spending our evening showers would be restricted to 3 minutes of hot and 1 of cold, because that's good for you. But largely, you know, it was clearly a very hectic, loud family. You know, everyone had an opinion. Factions formed. So you've got, you know, sisters and brothers would choose their favourites and groups would form. So we all got divided into little groups sometimes. So.
I mean, 9 kids is a lot for your mother to handle because she was at home looking after the children. What kind of mum was she?
Oh, she was a gorgeous person. Everyone loved Mum. And she just made it all look very easy. Like 9 children, what's the problem? We just thought it was very natural for her to be so relaxed and calm. She always stopped and she always was laughing, and very relaxed person and a lot of fun. So we were very lucky with our mother. She was a darling.
She had quite a tragic upbringing. What happened when she was young?
Well, several things, but one of the biggest tragedy was that she was born into quite a wealthy family. Her dad ran RKO Pictures, which films in the 1930s were a big thing in Australia. It's one of the first sort of thing. Everyone would go to the movies on the weekend. So anyone working in the film that back then made a lot of money. And the Depression was there at the time. So there was no social services back then, so everyone who had money would employ whoever they could. So she grew up with a cook and a gardener and a chauffeur and everything, because our people with money had to try and help. So she was very privileged like that. But sadly, her mother got almost certainly postnatal depression and died by suicide, in fact. So she was told very young, when she was about 11, that her mother was dead, and the method at the time was say, now we won't talk about that anymore. And that was how it was dealt with. And her father was very, very loving, and she was very devoted to her father. But that was it. She was she had some stepmothers after that who were also very nice to her. So she was lucky in that sense.
How did the loss of her mother at such a young age and not being able to talk about it affect her as she grew up?
I think a lot of people who go through trauma just bury things and carry on. I think that's what a lot of people do. I certainly see it amongst my patients. And it's a pretty clever strategy to survive childhood. Can it come back and harm us later? Yes, or rear its presence later? Yes, it can. But that's what I think she did. I think she just had to get on with things, and she ended up in boarding school, and the war was there soon after that when she was a young person, and so she volunteers as a Wren in the Navy. And so life carried on. And, when you've got things like the Depression followed by the war, I think people didn't spend a lot of time thinking about themselves and their needs. I think it was a society where people grew up thinking, well, what do I owe my country?
And what happened to her father when she was a young woman?
She married quite young. She met my father and they'd gone to England, and I think she was back when he also suicided. So she lost him as well. By that stage, she was a young mother and started to be very busy with her children. So again, I don't think there was a lot of time for grieving. There was a family to raise.
The fact that both her parents had died by suicide, did that affect her as a parent, by the time she had 9 children?
It's really hard to see how it did affect her. We saw no sign of that at all. We saw a lovely, happy, cheerful, generous. We all thought we were her favourite, which is quite a talent, isn't it? So I have to say I don't think I saw any sign that was there in her life. Quite remarkable. I had no idea about it until I was an adult.
She must have been quite young when World War II started. What did she do during that time?
She volunteered to be, I think it was in the Navy, where she had to push those little ships across the map so all the naval commanders could know where all the ships were. And so she always knew where all the sailors and the ships were. And people would always ask her, tell us when's the ship coming? And she was under strict orders, so she wasn't allowed to say, but she always knew.
Did she enjoy that time?
Oh, yeah. Sydney was a very exciting place at the time. It was full of US sailors and officers, and they were a lot of fun, dances and movies and, all sorts of fun things. But at the same time, of course, you got the echo of the war in the distant background. And of course, the Japanese come and bombed the harbour, so it wasn't quite so distant at times.
Tell me a bit more about the sailors, her encounters with sailors. There were some funny things they would say in King's Cross.
Oh, yes. Yeah, they would say things like, oh, you've got to come across tonight because this could be my very last time. I'm a virgin. I'm going off to war. I may never come back. It was a great line. It just didn't work.
Sailors would say this to her.
Mm-hmm.
How would she respond?
Oh, she'd go, oh, poo-poo, she said. Oh, that's ridiculous.
Did she go to university? Did she get a degree?
She did. She's quite a clever woman, and she went to university, but she had to leave to go and join my father when she met him, so she didn't complete a degree.
How did your father and your mother meet?
I think she was out in the Blue Mountains on a picnic with some young man, and then she met Dad, and she went home with Dad.
So she was on a date with someone else, met your dad,
yes.
Went home with your dad.
That's right. That was it. And they stayed together for her whole life, yeah.
Was it love at first sight?
Oh, yeah.
What did they love about each other?
I think Dad was an unusual man. Firstly, he was very serious and good-looking and careful and sincere. And I think she just fell for this charming, clever man. I think she was extremely devoted to him her whole life.
Tell me about your father as a father. What was he like as a dad?
If you ask every one of the 9 of us, we'd all have a different version. But my version is that I thought he was fabulous, and I related to him very, very closely. I felt I was the most like him. I'm the only one that became a doctor, but that's not all. I think I shared his very broad interests and a sense of adventure. And I think I got that very much from him. He's also an introvert, which I identify as. I'm kind of very happy in my own company.
You mentioned as a kid you'd have to do these exercises in the morning and take cold showers at night. That feels like a very militaristic kind of upbringing in a way.
Yeah.
Did that come from him?
Yeah, very much so. I think a lot of people after the war, they kept a lot of the militaristic culture, I think, and discipline was part of that. So some of the older children were very much under a much more disciplined culture. But by the time it was the 60s when I was growing up, and there was, too many to discipline, I think the young ones got away with a lot more. We had a lot more fun, I think.
You are from a Catholic family.
Yes.
If the 9 kids didn't give it away. What was your first experience of nuns at Catholic school?
Well, we used to walk to school, which was about a mile away, crossing several streets as a 5-year-old on my own or with an older sibling. And I remember those early nuns as some of them were very nice. They were also very scary because they had a very visceral description of hell and what would happen if you're naughty. So you picture yourself talking to a little 5-year-old and saying, if you sin, you could end up burning in hell. And then they would describe how a nun was in purgatory, who died, was in purgatory, and the boiling metal was dripping from her hands and it fell onto the praying nun who was praying for her soul, and it burnt her. So we got told all this when I was 5.
Did that
so
terrify
I still remember,
you?
Well, no, I don't scare easily.
Oh, even as a child, that didn't scare you?
I just remember saying, oh, that's pretty rich, So, but I remember that. So those nuns were very intense, you could say.
Would they
and they
hit
were also, there was also, corporal punishment. And I was never impressed by that. I thought that's not something that I was used to. We occasionally got the wooden spoon at home, but it wasn't the violence that came with a nun in a rage. That's a pretty scary thing. So I was very grateful to leave that school when I went to the Loreto convent, and there was none of that. They were much more enlightened, much better educated, and they wanted to see women educated. So they were sort of very feminist, really, even though they may not have used that word themselves, but they were very strong, independent women and could think on their feet and expected us to learn.
After finishing school with those nuns who encouraged that feminist spirit without calling it feminism in you, you went on to study medicine. And after you had your medical degree, you went traveling around the world. When you got back, what did you do?
Well, I had done a couple of years in hospital to complete my internship and residency before I went away, and I had decided that hospitals were not for me. I really didn't feel that those 4 walls were too constraining. So I did venture forth and travel. And when I came back, I was still searching for what I might do. And I thought, well, I'll just do some general practice until I decide. And I quite liked that. It was actually, you might guess, I really love people. and I love the opportunity to hear people's stories. And so general practice is the best place for that, because you really have a very privileged place to hear just what's going on in people's lives and what's happening for them or to them. So I did that, and that was great.
Tell me about a strange call you received at work one day.
Right. Well, when you're doing locums, you do get calls. So this one was unusual. It wasn't to go to another general practice. It was to go, they said, can you be free for working 10 weeks in the desert? I went, yes. And it's for a film crew and for about 100 people. And I went, yes. And they go, what would you like to get paid? I picked a number and doubled it, and apparently I should have made it 5 times. And they said, and can you start, in a week or 2? And I went, yes, I can. So
they wanted you to be the doctor on the film set.
That's right. It was an incredible trip. It was an amazing trip.
And so where did they want you to go?
Well, Burke and Wills was a film based on the true story, but we started in Darwin and worked in the Kakadu and in the swamps there. And then we travelled back across the outback down through Alice and Simpson's Gap, and then down further to Inaminka, where the Dig Tree is. Some people know this part of Australia. And then all the way back to Wilpena, Lake Mungo. And it was a fantastic opportunity to see parts of Australia that many people haven't.
For people unfamiliar with Burke and Wills, tell me what that film was about.
It was about 4 guys dying very slowly in the desert.
Okay, that's a grim sell.
Well, it was actually, the adventure was the fact that these men in late 1800s were deciding to try and walk from the south to the north and back again. Mm-hmm. And they had a party that took them as far as near Inaminka, what's called Cooper's Creek there. And then they set off with their camels and went further north. And when they reached the saltwater of the north, then they turned around and came back. In the film, it looked like they got to a beautiful sandy beach, but they never did. They only got to a kind of snake-infested swamp that was tidal. But the film took a little license with that scene.
And had you spent much time in remote Australia before getting this gig?
Dad had already bought a plot of land up in the Blue Mountains called Kurrajong, which was a little shack at the time. And so we used to, as kids, run pretty free in the bush up there. So I was familiar with outback or outdoors existence and camping and bush life. So I was relaxed with it. And we'd take holidays all the time, go camping up and down the coast. But I'd never been to some of these very remote spots.
And so what kind of medical treatment did people need on this film set?
Film crews are amazing. They work incredibly hard and they party incredibly hard and they know if they're only as good as their last job, so they have to turn up to work. And so they would do amazing things but still function. They're unbelievable work ethic. But apart from keeping the crew on their feet, I had to also supervise the calorie-restricted diets for the explorers who had to look like they were dying from starvation. So they had to lose weight on the trip.
But safely.
Safely. That was one of my jobs. It was fabulous. And another wonderful element of that was Sidney Nolan came along. So some people would be familiar with the artist Sidney Nolan's work of Burke and Wills. He did a number of series of Burke and Wills, and the last one was Burke and Wills on the camels, but this time there would be a cinematographer on the photos. So that was his series from when we were out there in the desert. So Sidney Nolan was great company. It was a lot of fun.
So you were there as a human doctor on set, but you also ended up having to treat mice. Can you tell me about that?
They tried to do a scene at night when the camp was overrun with mice. So they had to have these sleeping people and they had to have the mice looking like they were creeping across the sleeping people. And then there was a scene when all the mice were running everywhere. But to get the scene of the mice creeping was impossible because whenever they released the mice, they used to just scurry for cover. And so they went dark.
The mice wouldn't listen to the director's instructions about creeping.
So they called me and said, can you do something? So I think fast. And I had some Valium. So I'm calculating like weight of mouse, milligrams of Valium, and I'm drawing up tiny micro doses of Valium and injecting it into the mice. And the mice slowed right down and they got their shot.
And so the mice acted as they were instructed to once they were on the Valium?
That's right.
You got the creepy shot. Who did you meet while you were on set?
Well, amongst all those crew, there was a really remarkable man and he was fantastic at looking after all the crew. His name was Chris Hayward. He was an actor, but he wasn't just one of the actors. He also had a great notion of how to keep the spirit of the film alive. Even for some people who had never been out in the outback, they found it very confronting and scary. And he was fantastic for just keeping a party spirit and keeping everyone enjoying themselves. And I took notice of that, and I thought that was great. And so he noticed me, but I said, oh, well, look, that's okay. I noticed him, and then I knew I was going to be heading off to another job soon after that.
When you say notice, I feel like that's a euphemism, a polite way of saying you were interested in each other. How did you guys get along?
Oh yeah, no, he was so fun. He's a very charming and funny and entertaining person. So we really got on well. And also he's just a great spirit and a free spirit, a very adventurous person. And I was attracted to that.
During this time, you got a job offer that you couldn't resist. It was for a job in Antarctica. How did that come about?
Well, that was a dare. A friend of mine had been getting letters from me when I was travelling around the world, and I was saying, greetings from Tokyo, New York, London, and he got sick of that. He says, I want the next postcard from Antarctica, and he sent me an application. Doctor wanted for Antarctica, medical officer. So I filled out the application as a bit of a joke, really. I thought, oh, that'll be fun. I quite like it, and I sent it off, and I forgot all about it until I got that call that said, we're coming up to interview you from Hobart and we're flying into Sydney next week. Are you going to be there? These two doctors. And I was slightly taken aback. And I went, oh, sure. I had to suddenly think up, they're serious, I better look serious. And I sort of knew very few women go to Antarctica. There had been one other woman, but I thought they really don't take women down there. So I thought, I want to see how they're going to knock me back. It was a little bit of a game from my part. But I went along and I thought, actually, it'd be quite good. And by the time I went to the interview, I was actually going, actually be a great adventure and I can do some research down there. And I became quite enthusiastic by the time I attended the interview. I said, I'll go down there for 6 weeks and, say, been there. And they go, no, we want you for 3 years.
3 years in Antarctica?
Yeah. Well, a year in Hobart, a year in Antarctica, and a year in Melbourne to write up my MD that they wanted me to write. They wanted me to do a research degree because it's a research station. So I was able to complete my research down there and have a lot of fun at the same time. So anyway, the appendix was part of the deal, so out came the appendix.
Yeah, explain that. Why did you have to preemptively remove your appendix in order to do this job?
Well, because a few years earlier, a doctor had to remove their own appendix using mirrors and a scalpel and local anaesthetic.
Oh, my gosh.
Quite tricky. So they thought that wasn't a great idea. So they
wanted to eliminate the possibility of that happening again.
That's right.
So you got the job.
Got the job.
What did the job involve day to day?
Well, starting off, they said, well, what sort of research do you want to do? So I had a think about that. And I said, Antarctic expeditions, what do? They're very physically active. So I'll do something related to physical activity, exercise, and they like to drink. And so I'll do something on alcohol. And at the same time, fish oil was just becoming something that researchers were looking at. It wasn't available in all the health food shops or anywhere else, those little fish oil capsules. But there was some early research looking at that. So I ended up doing my MD on those 3 factors, looking at cardiovascular risk factors and seeing how physical activity, alcohol, fish oil, all affected cardiovascular risk.
Tell me about arriving in Antarctica. What was it like to step onto the ice there for the first time?
I was just thrilled to bits. I just was so excited. We had all our Antarctic clobber on. We get issued with Antarctic gear, and it was far too much gear on, but we had it all on, and we had to climb down a rope ladder carrying, with all this gear. The rope ladder was probably about 100 feet high, but, we land down on ice, and you're on this amazing continent, which it took us a month to sail there from Hobart. It's a fantastic ocean beneath us that's so vast and so beautiful. But then finally we're on this solid piece of ice, and then the Antarctic station was there. We had to walk across the ice to the station. And the station's been there for over 50 years or something. But it's slowly, we were in the middle of a building program. So we had about 100 builders with us. And my job was to look after them with their cuts and whatever happened to them and help with the building. So they said, well, we can't have the able-bodied men driving a cement truck. So they got the doctor to do it. So I ended up...
You drove a cement truck?
I drove the cement truck, yes. So I poured the base of the cement stations down there. And,
okay.
Yeah.
Another very varied job for a doctor.
I have a few.
And at both the north and south poles of the Earth, you get periods of time where there's sunlight all day in summer or nighttime all day when the sun never rises in wintertime. Were you there during one of these periods?
Yes, you arrive right in the middle of summer, so it's 24 hours of daylight. So the sun just hovers above the horizon and never dips below it. And so it just circles at a fairly low level, but right around and around. So you are in, and with the snow, it's very, very bright. So at 2 o'clock in the morning, you go outside and it's bright daylight. It's quite surreal. It's fantastic.
Yeah, was that disconcerting or magical in a way?
Doctors describe a condition down there called big eye, and it means big eye is when people just don't let themselves sleep because they respond to the light, and so they stay awake, and after a while they start to go a bit crazy. So my job was to encourage people to kind of wear eye patches and try and black out their rooms and try and simulate dark because it's not good for your health.
And what else did you have to sort of do day to day for the researchers down there? What kind of injuries or what were you treating?
Well, there wasn't many injuries because luckily the able-bodied men who were working, mainly men, there was a couple of women there. In the summer, I had to do the helicopter ride around all the icebergs looking for seal, and I did the seal count population. So I'd be up there counting how many seals come in ashore to have pups and so on.
And so day to day, what kind of doctoring were you doing for the researchers and crew down there?
Well, the reason I had to have a year in Hobart before I went down was because in the job interview they said to me, well, can you take out an appendix, and can you do a burr hole through someone's skull, and can you set a broken leg, can you do any dentistry? So it's a yes, no, have I ever done any of this? And so then they drew up a list of all the skills I had to learn. So I spent three days learning dentistry and how to put in a filling and pull out a tooth and so on. Wow. And then I learned an anaesthetics and how to work an anaesthetic machine and so on. So by the time I got down there, I had one whole mini hospital to run, and then people would come with whatever. So one fellow ruptured his Achilles tendon, and someone else got bitten by a seal, and there was no colds, there was no flu, because we're isolated. There's no germs coming through, so we're entirely free of germs for a whole year. It was fabulous.
So you had met the actor Chris Haywood on a film set a couple of years earlier before this, but you couldn't see him while you were down there in Antarctica for a whole year. Can you tell me about his romantic gesture, his grand romantic gesture as you were heading back to Australia?
Well, I had no idea this was going to happen, but they said, go up on the helipad. You need to go up on the helipad. And I thought maybe someone's been injured. Anyway, I make my way up to the helipad. The ship's sailing, so we're leaving the cold. We're coming into Hobart as the summer is there, and so it's getting warmer and warmer as the days go by, and so it's so exciting. And you could even smell the verdant greenery as you approach from way out to sea. You could smell land. It was an amazing thing to actually be able to smell it. And then I'm standing on the deck just noticing the warmth and the beautiful smell of the land approaching and the excitement of everyone on board who hadn't seen their loved ones for over a year. And then a helicopter or a plane came across, and the plane opens its doors, and out came 100 red roses, all with love messages on them, and they flutter down onto the ship, and so there's petals everywhere.
That's incredible coordination and planning to pull that off.
The ship's captain wasn't impressed.
Oh, no. Okay, so the ship's captain wasn't impressed, but what did your other crew members, think of this gesture?
Well, they came up. One bloke, I remember saying to me, "It's blokes like him that make it hard for blokes like us."
And at this point, are you still the only woman around?
Yeah, that's right. So there was women standing on the shore with their hands on their hips saying, "Where are my roses?"
So everyone was disappointed apart from you.
Yeah, funny.
What did you make of the gesture?
Well, I was a little overwhelmed. Yeah. I certainly hadn't expected it because, I figured things must have moved on after such a long time. But we sort of picked up where we left off, and a short while later, Felix was born.
So did you get married not long after that?
That's right.
And, start your lives together?
Right. Yeah.
And so not long after you had your children, you took your young family to the Pacific Islands, to Kiribati, to help treat blindness in the local community. What was your life like there?
Well, that was an extraordinary experience because you fly for hours and hours across the Pacific Ocean, and as you see the plane coming in lower and lower, you don't see any land. And then right at the last, you see this tiny little strip of land that's only like about 50 metres wide, ocean stretching into the distant horizon on either side. So the land mass is very, very tenuous, and on a big seas, it might wash right across the island. So that's Kiribati. It's a tiny little coral atoll. That island is. There's several of islands in the archipelago, but we landed on South Taronga, and it was an incredible place. I loved it there. The people were fabulous, and I was given a little, very simple bungalow on the beach, and we tried to work on this program to stop the blindness of babies there, and the local nutrition was very, very hard. There's no agriculture there, and very, very limited horticulture. And there was a very high rate of vitamin A deficiency causing the blindness. So a very simple program was just give the babies all a drop of vitamin A, and that would last at least 3 months. So it was actually reasonably easy to prevent the blindness. But in fact, the nutritional deficiencies were quite rife across all adults and children. So I started to try and look at ways to improve the nutrition there with the local people. And I worked very closely with the Kiribati people. And that took a year to try and bring some changes.
Yeah, why were people going blind? What was happening over there?
Well, what had happened is that traditionally, before Europeans came, it was always a very tenuous existence. So they lived on these terribly narrow things. They had breadfruit, coconuts, taro, and then fish. And so the Kiribati people are incredible fisher people. They go out across the sea. There was mainly men who did the fishing. That's enough to survive on if you live off the traditional food. But when Europeans came, they brought white stuff, white flour, white sugar, white rice, and that's very filling. So people are not hungry, but it's also very poor in nutrition. So that's where the vitamin deficiencies came. So they weren't often thin, the children. They were just very malnourished. So they got enough calories from the white food, but they didn't have the balanced diet that's necessary for eyes to see.
And so before that project, how quickly were the kids going blind, and were you able to stop some of that?
Yeah, so the reason the place was funded, of all the islands, all the places in the world, we had USAID money for this, was because Kiribati had the distinction, the dubious distinction of having the highest rate of blindness in the world. And this is talking about war zones and famines and everything else like that. So it was a really significant problem there. It was also a small population. The total population was about 72,000. So it's actually feasible to correct it with a reasonable budget. So that's why I think we got lucky. We got there and we had a containable problem.
So how did you go about changing attitudes towards diet or changing diet?
Well, when I arrived there was still a kind of a charity, we will help you, top-down sort of attitude towards the local people. And I was very fortunate because during the time I was there was a revolution in that thinking. It wasn't me, it was driven by the organisation I was in. But I was very, very grateful for that because they were able to see that it shouldn't be a charity, but it should be development. And development means enabling local people and making your presence superfluous.
And there was a feast that everyone organised in order to encourage people to change their attitudes towards diet. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, that's right. So as you know, all of us know, when it's hard to change how people eat and what they eat. So one of the ways I sought to bring that about was to invite all the chief women, because it's the women who do the cooking. So I asked the dean of the faculty, the minister for health, and the matron of the hospital, all these leading women, very influential women, all came to this wonderful feast, and we got the local people who'd been working with my organisation to cook a meal that was full of nutritional food, and we used the food that they normally gave to the pigs. That was the greens and the papaya and things like that, which were very rich in vitamin A.
They would give that to the pigs?
That was given to the pigs. That was seen as pig food. And if you fed people that, it was seen as a bit of an insult. So the big cultural shift was required. So when all the villagers saw these very senior, influential women eating this food, then that was the beginning of thinking there's possibly a change could be made. I'm not pretending I succeeded, but that was the approach we were trying to do. So it was a great job to kind of spend time feasting.
And so which foods give you vitamin A?
The colourful ones, so the rainbow foods we say, the greens, yellows, reds, oranges, that colour is vitamin A rich.
So you spent a year on Kiribati, then you came back to Australia. At a certain point, you started getting into meditation. What prompted that?
Well, I suppose I've always been a curious person, and when I could no longer adventure outward because I had 2 little children going to school, I figured I needed a different type of adventure, and I ventured into the mind. And I thought the best way to do that was to study the mind itself. And so I undertook that process quite seriously, actually. I studied it quite intensely for about 20 years, and that involved attending a Buddhist course on meditation. So it was a fabulously intense course, and I learned a lot.
Your interest in meditation led you eventually to a Bhutanese princess. Who was this person?
Yeah, well, she was a beautiful woman, and she is a beautiful woman. And it's complicated. I call her a princess for want of a better word. She had married the incarnation of the original founder of Bhutan. So as you know, if you have a Buddhist culture, you have a reincarnation is is an inherent part of their belief system. So when the original founder, a man called Shabdrung, died, he would be reincarnated. So they would find the reincarnate, and then when he died, he'd be reincarnated. So this man who was living in India was the ninth reincarnation. So when he
had been deemed by his community to be the ninth incarnation.
That's right. So he was recognised as that. And she married him, but then he died. So she, therefore, was the honoured consort of him, and therefore she was worshipped effectively. So when we arrived in Bhutan, the roads were lined with people. It was like a rock star, all with their hands held in the prayer position and bowing and smiling, and so thrilled to see her. It was an incredible scene.
How did you come to be her personal doctor?
She had come to Australia to help to raise some funds, and she'd run with another meditation master a meditation weekend which I'd attended. And at the end of it, I just said, look, I'm very grateful to you for this opportunity to study meditation with you, and if I can repay that anyway, I'm a doctor and I'm happy to try and be of some help. So one day she called me up at work and said, Gillian, can you come to Bhutan? I went, yeah, sure. She says, can you come next month? And I went, yes. And can you bring medicine? And I went, I think so. So I set off in that venture, that spirit of adventure, to find out a little bit about how the amazing society of Bhutan works. It's incredible because they have a very medieval honouring of royalty. They have a modern parliament. They have the monasteries, which are very strong and very influential, powerful presence in the community and work very closely with the local communities. And they have business. So they have a modern business as well. It's an incredible blend of cultures. It's quite incredible.
Right. Yeah. And did she have to, because she wasn't part of the official royal family, she was part of this founding family, did she have to hide at all from the authorities?
Yes, it was complex, and you're right. It wasn't announced, but the word would get out, and it would spread through the monasteries. Obviously not through the royal family. There was no connection to the royal family, and nor through the government. It was all done through the connections, through the monasteries.
In your GP practice back here in Australia, you treat many patients with functional illness. What is a functional illness?
I'm glad you asked that, Sana. A functional illness it's a silly name. I was going to say that first up because no one will understand that term. But what it really is, it's a symptom that you can have that arises when there's no physical illness present. So you go to the doctor and you might have fatigue, or you might have a pain, or you might have tingling, or you might have blindness even, and all the tests are done and your body's working perfectly fine.
So they can't find anything wrong?
There's no physical problem. So I'm trying to say there's definitely something wrong, and it is a medical problem, but it's not a physical problem. So the best analogy that I use is to call it it's like you don't have a hardware problem where something has to be taken out and replaced. You have a software problem where the programming of your whole body system is being disrupted.
Well, that makes me think you're talking about a mental issue, but it's not quite that either.
It's not that. It's very physical. If you wake up with the pain, there's no reason for you to think that's mental, and I would agree with you. The reason I wrote my book is that this is a concept that people don't understand, and I'm trying to make sure they do, because doctors do understand it, but it's very hard to explain because we tend to go, if it's not physical, therefore it must be psychological, and that's simply not true. There is the third way, and that's what this is about.
So explain that more. What are some examples of symptoms and why they would be there if there's no physical cause?
Yeah, I mentioned some of the common ones like pain and fatigue and nausea, but any symptom can actually be functional, any symptom. So you could have blindness, you could have paralysis, you could have a tingling, you can have numbness, you could have a gut churning. The commonest one that everyone knows about is irritable bowel syndrome. That's a very common one. So you go to a doctor, you've got pain, you've got diarrhea, you've got problems. The doctors do all the tests and they go, nope, your gut's perfectly fine. The colonoscopy, the endoscopy, all your blood tests, everything's fine. But these people are sometimes in severe pain and very uncomfortable with their symptoms, but it's a functional condition.
And so what causes this then?
Well,
if it's not disease?
I've described in my books the two states, and this is a very oversimplification, but I've said there's two states. So there's the state I call the restorative mode, and there's the state that I call the defensive mode. So the restorative mode is what you've enjoyed when you're sitting relaxing, it's a sunny day, not a care in the world, you're surrounded by loved ones, and you're feeling really good. Your body's at ease, and your digestion's working well, and you feel great. So that's the restorative mode. The opposite might be the defensive mode. Let's say a stress response that you haven't slept all night for whatever reason, and you wake up the next morning, you're achy, you're tired, you're fatigued. A good night's sleep will fix that. So a lot of functional symptoms simply go away quite quickly.
Okay, right.
Yeah, but so at least 2/3 of them go, but a third of them will persist. And it's those ones who come and see doctors, and it's those ones sometimes they persist, sometimes for months or years. And I'm trying to help people recognise that that's what the symptoms are. Of course, it requires the doctors to do due diligence and make sure that physical conditions have been ruled out. But once that's been done, then we can usually move into a space where it can be presumed to be functional. People get very anxious about that. I'm going, if a physical symptom arose and declared itself, we'll change our tune. But it's a reasonably safe assumption once the proper tests have been done.
This sounds like the kind of thing people might have for a long time been told is all in their head, particularly women.
Yes.
Is there a tendency to dismiss this kind of very vague sort of thing?
Yes, I think that's a term I very much... I won't use that term. It's certainly not in their head. It needs to be said these physical symptoms are very real. They're not imagined. It's certainly not in their head. The causes of them are complex. We think there could be a genetic element. We think there could be an epigenetic element. That means some change in genes. There can be possibly worse in certain people, like people on the autism spectrum, people who have had trauma, sometimes it happens for people who have just been very sick for a long time, physically sick. They do have epilepsy, they do have asthma, for example. An asthmatic who suddenly can't breathe, is it asthma, or could that be a functional form of breathing difficulty? Very difficult to work that out. It can be worked out if someone's interested enough.
Can stress cause it as well?
Yeah, I think all of us who've ever... I did a lot of medical exams. I can say I probably got functional symptoms every time. A dry mouth, a churning gut, like that. It goes away at the end of the exam. So we can all relate to those very familiar patterns. I'm sure everyone's had that.
Right.
It's when you wake up in the middle of the night and suddenly you have chest pain. And in my book I describe Kiribati, who had this, terribly frightening, heart was pounding, the chest was painful. She thought she was dying, and it's quite reasonable for her to think that. She calls an ambulance, goes to hospital, they do all the tests are normal, and they say, you're fine to go home. So that would happen night after night for Kiribati. And imagine that.
That's
it's
scary.
Very scary. And it took me a lot to persuade her that it was a functional condition. Only after years did she come back and we've got to the source of it for her.
What was the source for her?
Well, for her, it was almost certainly early childhood traumas. And she was able eventually to recognise that she was often living in that hypervigilant state, and recognising the role of that hypervigilance in triggering the symptoms helped her to work on that over months. And she was amazingly dedicated to addressing that. And through her dedication, she got better.
And so is functional illness about us being sick, or is it a function of the way we're living or what happens to us as we move through life?
All of the above. So if you're already unwell, you can get more functional symptoms, because illness, a physical illness, is a stress in itself, of course. Say you've just had an operation, you can have functional symptoms as a result of having had the operation. So you've broken your leg, and then you have continuing pain, and the doctor's saying your bone's fixed, there's nothing wrong with you, your bone's fixed, but the pain continues. So that's a type of functional symptom. That's ongoing pain where there's no physical cause for it. There's a disruption to the way the nerves are carrying messages to the brain, and there is something wrong. And if we could actually measure what's actually getting transmitted to the brain, we'd find there is something wrong, but we can't measure that easily. We can with a very sophisticated test called a functional MRI, and those tests are research equipment. We don't have
not
that.
available to
not
average patients.
available to us, and that's the thing. But under research, they can see real changes in the brain of people who have ongoing functional symptoms.
So how common is functional illness? And is it becoming more common because of how stressful, our lives are increasingly?
It's a good question. I don't know the answer to the second part, but the research says, and there's been quite a lot of research on this, so the research says about 2 out of 3 patients who come and see someone like myself, a GP, do have physical symptoms, but about 1 in 3 will have symptoms for which all the tests are normal, in which case it's a functional symptom, quite likely.
So what do you want people to understand most about functional illness? If there's one thing they take away, what would you like them to know?
Well, I'd always want doctors to give people proper diagnosis. That would mean that they're listened to, they're examined, the tests are done for the patient for whatever symptom they present. But when all the tests are normal, then I'd want both the doctors and the patients to start using this word and start saying, could this be functional? Let's see what happens. Let's try this, see what happens, and keep a dialogue. So the only way to cure people, there isn't a single pill or a single pathway. It's a dialogue, it's a process, it's a relationship. And the job of the doctor and the patient is to try something in good faith and follow through and say, did that help? And then if it doesn't help, try the next thing or add a second thing and see if that helps. And this is how we help people recover. So it's adding on, working, and people beginning to see that they actually respond well.
Do doctors generally recognize this or know about functional?
Doctors can recognise it, but we are very poor at using the language to describe it. And it's also hard because patients say it's hard for people to accept it because they don't realise it's a thing.
You have done so many incredible, adventurous things across your career, from working on film sets in remote Australia to going to Antarctica and the Pacific. Gillian, it's been lovely talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sana. I really enjoyed it.
My guest today was Dr. Gillian Deakin, whose new book is called What the Hell is Wrong with Me? How to Recover from Pain, Fatigue, Weakness, and Other Undiagnosed Symptoms. Today's episode was recorded on Gadigal country. It was produced by Alice Moldovan. Our executive producer is Carmel Rooney. I'm Sana Kadar. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to a podcast of Conversations. For more Conversations interviews, please go to the website abc.net.au/conversations.